All right, another episode of Why We Do What We Do with Abraham from the Why We Do What We Do podcast. Super stoked on this one. This one could be a little bit of a touchy one when we're talking about
keyboard.
when we're talking about sensory integration therapy. So Let's start with a little bit of history, what it is, maybe.
Okay, so if we, just going back in time, this started with Anna Jean Ayres, I think I'm saying that right, who got her doctorate degree in essentially occupational therapy and was very interested in advocating for individuals with special needs, and all of that was really great. And she then formed this hypothesis that if you look at populations of children who have intellectual, developmental, or neurological disabilities, they often demonstrate some very challenging behaviors that can be aggressive or self-destructive, things of that nature. And she hypothesized that was how their brain was processing the sensory information from their world visually, auditorily, kinesthetically, proprioceptively, all of those things. And while there's nothing inherently wrong with the idea that the brain is involved, obviously that's the case, this wasn't necessarily based on any direct evidence of the processing as being the problem with those behaviors that were being observed. That being said, essentially what I think is relevant to understand here is that led to this idea that we just need to create this super sensory rich environment to get at they're either hyper or hypo stimulated, and that we have sort of a free reign access where they can just sort of play around and do things. And that was the treatment for the problem of them not processing their sensory information appropriately. And that has led to a variety of things. There are sensory integration centers. If you go to one, you will see what looks like a glorified playground, jacked up on every imaginable toy that you can think of. And it's also like expensive equipment. So you've got these giant foam pits, and these huge like towers that they can climb and blocks they can play with and swings, and they have some sort of restrictive things, so they'll have kids all wrapped up really tight. Things like you might find weighted vests there, which we've talked about. And again, the idea is they would just come here and would expose these kids to these highly structured and I guess stimulating environments. And what often would be the case is that the kid would be engaging in these challenging behaviors, and then they go to these environments to calm them down. And what happens is, in the moment, they do calm down. They just got an awesome world handed to them. And they got an awesome world handed to them when they did something destructive or problematic. So essentially what I think there is to be learned in this is that there's nothing inherently wrong with the idea that we want to have them have access to these really cool environments, but to do so in a way that's not teaching them, you got to engage in this destructive behavior. That'll get you this cool world that we built for you. Because that seems to be what's happening, is that's reactive to the problem. And if it were to either be proactive in terms of just sort of having access to it in the absence of those things, or having access to it as a reward for doing well, then we'd be more likely to see a therapeutic benefit. And so my biggest concern is how it's currently being applied.
It's the devil's in the details of how it's being applied.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Yes. So what about on the antecedent side? So prior to problems when it comes to maybe brushing and those other sort of applications.
Yeah. So those are things where they're not necessarily harmful per se. If they are being used as rewards, and they're being used as rewards following challenging behavior, then they could become problematic. The biggest issue I have is that, one, they aren't going to change anything necessarily, especially not as just an antecedent of like, I'm just going to brush your skin. Again, we have no evidence to suggest that there are actual problems with their ability to process that sensory information. So there's no reason to believe that's going to do anything, and plenty of evidence to suggest that it won't. But the other thing that might be difficult about it is it can be kind of stigmatizing, and unnecessarily so. So like, people aren't usually picking up their kids and getting a horse brush and just sort of, rubbing it on their face. That looks weird because it is weird. And so these kids who are already in a situation where they're maybe having trouble being integrated into an environment that has more access to social interactions and independence and things like that, well, now they're showing up in a way that looks weird because their parents have got this giant brush thing they're rubbing all over their skin, and kids are thinking like, I don't want to hang out with that weirdo.
Yeah.
So it's just another thing to be concerned with in terms of it's not going to do any, like even if you're in the privacy of your home, it's not going to do anything, and then it just looks weird to the kids that might be a part of that environment. And yeah, we can go about, like, let's try and raise this huge awareness campaign to teach all the kids in the world that we're going to be brushing other kids sometimes, and that's just a thing that we do, but there's no purpose to doing it. So it just seems like why waste the time and money and effort on something that has no real effect.
There was a research study. Do we want to hit on that?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so part of sensory integration therapy, tangentially related, is something called the sensory diet. We talked about this in our 2-year anniversary episode, I believe, when we had the ABA Inside Track folks on with us. And the sensory diet is not actually a diet. It has nothing to do with the food per se. It has to do with going about how you would address contexts of feeding, meal times, and often this is applied when you have individuals, children most of the time, who are not eating enough, or they have some challenge with their eating, or often what's been the case is they had some kind of injury to their mouth, and so they refuse to food because it hurts or it's difficult. And so there are issues of just them having access to adequate nutrition. And the sensory diet approach is similar to what we've described, where it's not super structured in terms of how to systematically introduce food, but the systems that do exist have a hierarchy of having them approach food. And in those systems, the terminal goal is not actually to have them eating. And at no point in the measures is it measured that they consumed the food, just that they approached it. And this really awesome study came out a few years ago where the authors got certified and trained in how to do a sensory diet approach to these feeding issues. And they compared that approach to a behavior analysis or behavior modification approach of how to arrange those situations such that the kids were likely to choose eating and to do so voluntarily. And that also that they specifically rewarded those behaviors that resulted in them eating, and that's what they ultimately were measuring, was whether they consumed the food, which seems like an important measure since then we need them to eat to survive, and found that all the kids in this study, and this was a small N study, they spent over 1,000 minutes in the sensory integration of the sensory diet approach first, and made 0 gains toward actually consuming the food. Some of them did increase their approach, but nobody actually consumed any food. And so then they switched over to their behavior analysis model, and were able to increase across the board, everybody consumed food, and the fastest one was in only 16 minutes.
Really?
Yeah. And now the author of the method that they use, their lawyer, actually contacted them and sort of reprimanded them, saying, you can't call your approach by the name of our approach because you changed some things about it, which was they didn't go for as long as the approach would normally go for.
Okay.
And they also didn't spend as much time. There was something about at the front end, how they like how long the sessions were, I think. So it was like supposed to be 20 minutes and they did it for 15 or something like that. So those were some of the modifications that were that they made, and I think those were the only two.
Yeah, okay.
And
so those are critiques to hold?
Yeah, well, while that's the case, if they had done that exactly and they followed it to its logical end, and maybe they had seen an effect of following the full program as it's designed, even if that had worked, their approach was still way more efficient, almost 100 times more efficient than the other one. So, and when you're talking about nutrition, there's not time to lose.
Yeah.
You can't just mess around with, oh, well, they'll just want to eat for a few weeks. That's okay.
Yeah.
Like, no, that's not okay. Time is extremely important.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you think is important to hit?
I think I'll just say that I want to leave on the note that it tends to be occupational therapists who use sensory integration therapy, and this discussion is in no way intended to belittle what the occupational therapists do. The point is to talk about sensory integration therapy as a specific practice, and you don't have to be an occupational therapist to do it, but that tends to be the people who do it.
I know behavior analysts that have slid into this area as well.
Right.
Speech language pathologists. Like there's many in the human services sector that slide into this.
Right. And the point primarily here is that it's used, as we talked about, sort of the order in which things occur is really important, and that it's used in a way that it's going to ultimately have a therapeutic effect for the people who are being served in those models. That's all I think is the main point.
Which is really the point of all of these fields at the end of the day.
Right.
Help people out, think about it. So the goal here is an open discussion.
Yeah.
Hope we can continue that.
It's really like, let's get on the same team.
Yeah.
Because we're not on the same team currently.
Yeah, and there's a full episode link down below, so go check it out.
Cool.
All right, if you're into this, please like, share, subscribe. If you want to see more of this, the top link in the description is where you can support and gain access to more videos. And if you haven't already, check it over here on YouTube. There's a few different playlists. I think you're going to enjoy them. That's your Daily BA.